go. If you can't see the deck, do let us know. And I'll say right at the outset that as I'm talking and then Ryan is talking, we're going to go back a little bit, back and forth a little bit, but we will have a Q&A session at the end. So as you think of things, please put your questions in the Q&A. You can type them in, and we'll try to get to as many as we can after we get through our talk. So what I'd like to talk to you about today a little bit first is the history of fake news. And then I'm going to give you some definitions because it's a term you hear bandied about quite a bit. So I think we need to be sure we're all on the same page. Ryan will then talk a little bit about who falls for fake news and why we believe it. And then at the end, I'll come back and give you some tips for spotting fake news online. We'll also have a resource sheet for you that I think that Sita has put together with some resources from Ryan and me. So hopefully you'll have a chance to learn something and get some of your questions answered, and we can have a discussion. So I'm just going to say at the outset that this idea of bad information is nothing new. Mark Twain is famously quoted as saying that it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled. So we're used to getting bad information, and we're also used to, it's not new that we believe it. This problem is old. It's been around for a long time. Some people trace the beginning of fake news or bad information, false stories to the beginning of printing, to the invention of the printing press. It's after the printing press was invented, of course, fake news and disinformation traveled to the new country a couple of hundred years later. John Adams is famously said to have railed against freedom of the press, thinking that it was just going to be a method to propagate more error than had ever been seen before. And one of the reasons that that was true then, just as it is now, is that fake news or titillating information is a way to sell newspapers. That too is not anything new. I don't know that anybody here, unless you're a historian or just like to search for strange things online, but there was something called the Great Moon Hoax of 1835, where a respected New York newspaper published a series for 6 weeks, supposedly showing life on the moon and attributing these findings to a then well-known astronomer. And as I said, it took 6 weeks for it to come out that this was just a hoax, because fake news sells, and that remains true today. So why are we talking about it now? What is the difference between the Great Moon Hoax of 1835 and the kinds of things we are seeing now? The answer to that, of course, is the number of people who are online and the speed at which this kind of news, any kind of news, can spread. And if you just look at some of these statistics, you can see Facebook with nearly 2.5 billion monthly users, and Twitter with 330 million monthly users. YouTube, 2 billion monthly users. And the statistic that always floors me every time I say it is that the estimates are that at least 300 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every single minute. So never before has news of any kind had such a big audience. Never has there been so much news, and never has it been able to spread so quickly. And that phenomena called going viral is what has led us to the position we're in today, where many of us, you'll hear about this, of all ages, have trouble distinguishing between what's real and what's not. And we can be overwhelmed by just the amount of information we're getting and need some help figuring out what we can believe. The days of Walter Cronkite saying, and that's the news, folks, have been replaced by this new world that we're all learning how to navigate. So let's talk about some definitions, because fake news itself is a term that has become problematic. I'll talk about that in a minute. But what do we mean? And I'm going to ask you a couple of times in this talk to just bring your common sense to bear. My former career was as a lawyer, and we always used to tell juries that you don't leave your common sense at home. And when you are evaluating fake news, you don't leave your common sense at home for that either. And you already know, I'm sure, I know this is a sophisticated audience, but you also know probably more than you might think if you haven't thought about this issue specifically. So for example, parody and satire is a form of fake news. I don't know, I wish I could see all of your hands. I'd like to see who else. Jon Stewart was my favorite show. I'm still devastated that it went off the air. I knew that what he was delivering was not the news, much as he might try to make it look that way. But it wasn't an issue because I was in on the joke. When we're watching parody or reading satire, we're in on the joke. So yes, that's a form of fake news or misinformation, but it's not the kind that we're concerned about. And there's another kind of news that you could fit into the fake news bucket, which we're also deeply familiar with, commonly called propaganda, or more specifically, advertising. So if you see on your television set or on a billboard, the right hand side of this hamburger with a McDonald's ad, you probably know, if you've been to McDonald's, that you're not going to get that hamburger. You're going to get a hamburger, but it's not going to look like that. It's going to look much closer to the one on the left, or even possibly smaller than that. But again, we're kind of in on the joke, right? We know that this is advertising. We know it's puffery, and we know that we don't need to believe it, and nobody gets too excited about it unless it crosses over into an area where it's harmful. But again, the propaganda and advertising, you could argue that these are forms of fake news. What we're concerned about now, though, are things where we're not in on the joke, where we can't spot immediately whether something is true or whether it's just a joke, and we really need to think about things. And I want to give you an example of the kinds of ways that news can be put out today that are brand new. And one of the most serious problems that we face in evaluating what we see online is the fact that images themselves can now be manipulated. So I'm sure everybody out there remembers the school shooting in Parkland, Florida. This is a cover shot that was taken for Teen Vogue magazine. And the young woman in the middle, Emma Gonzalez, and the others with her were all survivors of the Parkland shooting. And for this Vogue shoot, they held up an image of a target practice sheet, a bullseye, and they're shown holding it up to make a statement against gun violence. That was what the cover was, and that was the intent. But just an example of what can happen online, the image was later manipulated to show these same four young women ripping up what appears to be the US Constitution. And you wouldn't know, just looking at it, that this was a fake image. That's it's an example of some of the kinds of issues that we're dealing with now that are much harder to spot. The other point I want to focus on, as I mentioned, is what we actually mean by the term fake news. I keep thinking I should change the name of this talk and the words I use when I give it, because this term is bandied around so much that it's almost become meaningless. But in its traditional scholarly definition of fake news is news that is intentionally and verifiably false. And the real academics would urge you to call that disinformation. And then there's a form of fake news known as misinformation, which is mistaken information. These don't roll off the tongue, so I've decided to stick with the term fake news, but I just want you to know that it's a little bit more nuanced. It can be intentionally false. It can be mistakes that get out there. An example, though, of an intentionally false statement that was meant to manipulate is this supposed news article that came out in the last election that Pope Francis had endorsed Donald Trump. And we're going to come back to this a little bit more, including with some tips on how you could have figured that out back in 2016. The problem with the term fake news, as I alluded to, is that even the term now can be misleading, because now it is often the case that people who don't like a particular kind of news will call it false, even though it can be verified with photographs and other sources. So it's problematic. I just want to note the problem. At the moment, I don't have a better idea of what to call it. But when you talk about fake news, just know that it can cover a whole host of things, including things that are true, but that people wish were false. Okay, so with those definitions in mind, I'm going to point out what is now so obvious. I have to say, when I started looking into the question of bad information and how to help people spot it, I was really concerned about the political nature of it, in part because, it's particularly with respect to older people, in part because we are consistently the group that turns out in the highest numbers to vote. That has remained true for decades. But it also was concerning to me because fake news is not just political. There's been fake health news out there for a long time, and the pandemic has taken it to a new level. I'm sure you've seen so many examples of this. This is just one. This was a Facebook post that made its rounds before being taken down, that if you just boiled some orange peels and breathed in the steam, you could help yourself to avoid getting a COVID-19. So fake health news is as problematic, if not more, particularly for older people. And it is so prevalent now that the Director General of the World Health Organization has said that we are both in a pandemic and an infodemic, because health news has gone beyond the pale in terms of what's out there. So with that, I'm going to turn the next section over to Ryan, who will talk about who falls for fake news and give you some more information on some of the studies that have been done on this topic.
Hey everybody, super happy to be here. Glad to see so many people interested in the topic. As Susan mentioned, I'm going to talk about who falls for fake news. Maybe some of you in the audience have ideas about who those people might be. We've primed you a little bit in our intro, but I'm going to talk about some of the research that tries to answer this question. In terms of scientific research, it unfortunately takes a few years for studies to get published, data to be collected, analyzed, written up, and ultimately published. So a lot of the published research that's come out in the past year or so has been actually about fake news in the lead up to the 2016 election. And so what I'm going to share with you are some of the headline findings from this body of research that looked at fake news online, mostly social media, in 2016. The main sort of signature of all of the studies that have been done for the most part is that only a small number of people are really exposed to fake news. You might think that with all of the misinformation examples that we're going to talk through in this talk, and I'm sure that you can think of or that you've seen, like the research ultimately finds that only a small number of a certain type of people are exposed. For example, researchers that looked at fake news on Twitter found that 1% of Twitter users were the ones exposed to 80% of the fake news on Twitter. So as you can see, the distribution of people who are exposed to this content is highly skewed. Zooming out a little bit from Twitter and just looking at fake news websites, another study found that 6 in 10 visits to fake news websites came from just 10% of people, and these happen to be the people with the most conservative online information diets. So they were people who are on the right consuming misinformation or disinformation or fake news that presumably was congenial to their views. Now, we think about fake news, we think about politics. Maybe you might think, and a lot of researchers had this hypothesis, that fake news is explainable through politics, that a certain persuasion, whether it's the liberals or many people thought conservatives, that conservatism was driving exposure to fake news and was driving sharing of fake news, and that a certain side of the political spectrum was responsible for sharing this content. However, now that some of the research has been done, it ended up finding a different sort of explanation for differences in who tends to fall for this information and who shares it. And as Susan alluded to earlier, this is age. Researchers have found that people 65 and older tend to share the most fake news on social media. For example, people 65 and older were 7 times more likely to share fake news on Facebook in the lead up to the 2016 election than people 18 to 29. And this age-related finding was robust, even when controlling for other characteristics that we might think are important in who shares fake news, such as education, political ideology, partisanship, etc. And so this finding was sort of surprising, maybe to some researchers. And so currently, initiatives exist to try to educate older people about how to spot fake news online, and researchers are still adamantly trying to understand what causes this kind of finding. And so in my graduate program, I'm working on this very question of sort of why older adults, why do they tend to share deceptive news content online at such greater rates? And so what I want to do is just share some of the possible explanations that researchers have come up with for why this might be the case. First, there are cognitive issues that face older adults. Research suggests that fact-checking information, which we're going to discuss in depth later, may fade from older adults' memories while original fake news stays intact. The idea is that older adults have a strong preference for fluent information processing experiences. And if they see a piece of fake news multiple times, but then maybe at one of those times they see a fact check, that introduces sort of a disfluency. And so they're likely to forget the disfluent fact-checking corrective information while remembering the fluent fake news story more than younger adults. Another possible explanation, Susan, if you could actually just go back one bullet point. Sorry about that. Another possible explanation is that research has shown that older adults are more likely to forget source information compared to younger adults. And what does this mean? So as we'll discuss later, paying attention to sources, where information comes from and who shared it, is an important and critical way to identify fake news. There are mainstream legitimate sources who are very unlikely to produce and share false content, and there are unfamiliar or even malicious sources which spread fake news. Psychological research suggests older adults are less likely to remember the sources where information comes from compared to younger people, and therefore may be more likely to fall for fake news from questionable sources. But at the same time, the whole explanation for this phenomenon is likely not due entirely to cognitive differences in people as they age. Compared to younger people, older adults have a lifetime of knowledge and experience making judgments about people, situations, events, and pieces of information to inform their judgments today that younger people simply do not have access to. There are also changes in social interaction that occur as people age. So first, trust tends to increase with age. Research suggests that older adults are more trusting of both people they know and people they don't know compared to younger adults. The manifestation of this trust bias in the digital and online environment could mean that older adults are more trusting than they otherwise should be of sources of fake news. Relatedly, older adults also tend to put less of an emphasis on accuracy when communicating with others. So researchers have found that when older adults communicate with others, they primarily pursue goals of engagement and flow when recounting a story or information, sometimes at the expense of accuracy. Additionally, older adults tend to feel a duty to inform their communities of relevant information or events, which could be a really helpful thing and is, but again, not so much maybe if that information is inaccurate. Next, and I think perhaps most relevant, are digital challenges facing older adults. Older adults are relative newcomers to social media compared to younger adults. And it's not just social media, it's a variety of modern communication technologies. But while older adults may have been slower to come online and come to social media platforms, their usage is currently booming. For example, the fastest growing user group on Facebook is people 65 and older. Being newer to these platforms may mean less familiarity with features, cues, and structures that could make somebody who is just trying to figure out how a site works more vulnerable to false information. Additionally, a recent study found that older adults were worse at distinguishing fake from real images compared to younger adults. This is really relevant to the deep fakes and manipulated images that Susan mentioned earlier. And this is important to keep in mind given how multimodal the content on social media platforms is, combining text, videos, images, sounds, etc. And finally, and in part because of these research findings, older adults are unfortunately huge targets of fake news online. Purveyors of disinformation and fake news target older folks with their content, and so it may only be natural this demographic tends to be more likely to share it just because they're getting so much. But with all that in mind, it's not just older people who are struggling to separate fact from fiction online. Professor Sam Weinberg and his team at the Stanford History Education Group studied younger people's online savviness with some sobering results. In a 2016 study, over 80% of middle school students couldn't tell the difference between news stories and sponsored content. And in a follow-up study in 2019, they found that 96% of high school students surveyed failed to consider that ties to the fossil fuel industry might affect the credibility of a website about climate change. And more than half believed a grainy video on Facebook that claimed to show ballot stuffing, the video was actually shot in Russia, that it constituted strong evidence of voter fraud in the United States. So certainly relevant to today. The difference, the key difference that I want to emphasize and that Susan is doing great work on here in the Bay Area is that states are requiring and investing and prioritizing digital literacy education for younger people in schools, and millions of dollars are being spent on this pursuit. This is not really the same as the situation with digital literacy and digital literacy education with older adults. And this is really important because ultimately it's important to foster digital skills among any demographic group, but as Susan mentioned, older adults are the group who vote consistently in democracies around the world. They're the most likely to turn out to vote. And so I think these initiatives are particularly important, not just for younger people, but also for older people. And finally, sharing some really recent research. This came out about 2 weeks ago related to the coronavirus and fake news related to that. Researchers at Northeastern University did a study of 11 false stories about COVID-19. They found the highest level of belief in all 11 false claims, things like taking antibiotics protects you against COVID, were strongest among people under 45, and that the older the age group, the lower the average level of belief in false claims. So again, it's not just older people. It seems that maybe in some domains such as health, older people may actually be more savvy at protecting themselves from false information. So this is a growing issue that we're trying to understand as it unfolds. So with that in mind, who shares fake news and who falls for fake news? I want to talk a little bit about why people in general might fall for fake news. First off, it's targeted. The way that social media platforms and online search engines like Google work is that they track your past behavior, and they also have information about your demographics, your preferences, etc. And they target you with articles or search results that they think you might like based upon your usage of their website and the information you gave them when you signed up. And so the information that you're getting is stuff that you probably are likely to engage with and likely to believe. And that goes into the second point, which is confirmation bias. A large body of research that goes back decades in psychology suggests that when we see information, whether it's news or other information that is consistent with what we already believe, we're more likely to believe that that information is true simply because it's what we want to hear and it comports with our worldview. And so as algorithms and online systems target us with information we're likely to believe, this problem gets worse. Third, there's just so much information out there, it can be hard to stop and think or to do fact checking or to do searches to see what, to assess the veracity of a piece of information. There are no longer 3 nightly news channels, and we get bombarded with information on social media and online. And so there's just so much information, it can be hard to wade through. And finally, the cues are not necessarily obvious. It's not like the National Enquirer's outlandish headlines that you might see when you're in the supermarket checkout line and oh, well, the National Enquirer, that information is likely bogus. You can't tell often just by looking at a site if it's giving you accurate or inaccurate information. And in fact, the most sophisticated fake news and disinformation purveyors dress their sites up on purpose to look as similar to legitimate news sites as possible so that they can increase the level of belief in whatever junk they're sharing. And so before I pass it back to Susan, I just want to just hammer home this idea of algorithms and recommender systems, because it is my view that they're exerting a large influence on the information we consume online, and I think are really related to fake news. So I just want to walk through an example of what I'm talking about specifically. So this is a little experiment that I actually did myself. So YouTube, which is a rapidly growing online news platform, this is a video of Tucker Carlson Tonight, which is a program on Fox News that I watched. And so and I don't tend to watch Fox News or Tucker Carlson very often, but because I watched that single video, what YouTube does is it says, okay, you watch a Tucker Carlson video, and in the other side of my screen and all of the content it wants to recommend to me based on me watching one Tucker Carlson video, it recommends another Tucker Carlson video, a video from Steven Crowder, who's a prominent conservative online personality, and other videos from other prominent conservative online personalities. And so even just one touch on a piece of information can result in this case, YouTube, but all the online platforms do this, targeting you with more information that is similar to that in terms of, ideology or whatever. The important part here for fake news is that being surrounded by all of this information that comports with what we already believe might lower our defenses against falsehoods, because we think, oh, this people all agree with me. This is exactly what I'd like to hear. And so I just wanted to take time to walk through this, because I think it's a really important signature of today's online information consumption.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. So I hope we haven't thoroughly depressed you with the state of the world, but we are going to talk now about what we can do, and hopefully give you some tips that you can use, maybe some things you already know, maybe some things you haven't heard before. I want to go back really quickly to that Stanford History Education Group study that Ryan mentioned. In addition to the finding that students as well were having trouble with fact checking and distinguishing what's real and what's not, they looked at why and what the best methods might be. And I'm going to just relate some of those findings to you today. The number one recommendation that came out of the Stanford History Education Group studies was that in order to not get sucked in by fake news, to think like a fact checker, a professional fact checker. So it's a phenomenon that they refer to as lateral reading, and I'm going to walk you through it. So in the Stanford study, they asked students as well as professional fact checkers to research an issue. And the issue was a proposed hike in minimum wage. And one of the sources for the evaluating the proposal that both the students and the fact checkers were given was this website put out by something called the Employment Policies Institute. And the headline on this is, "Businesses are closing because of the fight for $15. So you can see that this is an anti-minimum wage site. It's arguing that minimum wage is going to make businesses close and that the businesses are the real victims of higher minimum wage laws. And the question that was posed in the study was, is this a reliable site? Is this something where if you're trying to make up your mind about a proposal or a news issue of the day, is this the kind of thing that you can trust? Well, what did people do? The students, by and large, tended to look at the site, as I'm sure many of us have done in the past, and they looked, just stayed on the page and went to this About Us tab up here and clicked on the About Us tab to see what they could learn. And they click on the if you click on the About Us tab, you'll see that the Employment Policies Institute is a nonprofit research organization dedicated to studying public policy issues surrounding employment growth. And if you go down here a little bit farther, you'll see that EPI sponsors nonpartisan research conducted by independent economists at major universities around the country. Well, that sounds pretty good, right? Sounds reasonable. Sounds like they might know what they were talking about. And in fact, that's what the majority of the students in the study surveyed by Sam Weinberg and his team concluded, which was this was a trustworthy site. Well, that's not what the professional fact checkers did. What they did to determine if they could believe what the Employment Policies Institute was telling them was leave the site, Google it. Here's just a screenshot of how you would do that. You want to be sure you get all three of these words so you can narrow your search, put them in quotes. The professional fact checkers went to Google and did their own research on what this EPI was. And here it's interesting to see what they come up with. So if you Google Employment Policies Institute, you come up with a page of Google results. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but here you can see you've got some options for where you might click to see what others are saying about EPI. And let's just say that you decide to go with the New York Times and see what the New York Times has to say about the Employment Policies Institute, which, as I said, is what the professional fact checkers did. And what you'll find, I didn't put the whole article up here, but you would find reporting that the EPI is run by a public relations firm that also represents the restaurant industry, that it's part of a tightly coordinated effort to defeat the minimum wage increase, and that it is part of a web of industry ties aimed at defeating the proposal. None of that information is in the About Us section of EPI, of course, because if you can put out a website with unreliable information, you can darn well write an About Us page that sounds like you know what you're talking about. And that's what EPI did. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you can find other sources that will give you a more balanced view of whether or not the site is reliable. So I want to say a word about this method of fact checking and Google results, because of course, if you type something into Google, you're going to get, I'm sure you're all familiar with, a long list, depending on what you've looked for, of results. And you might think that the lists are somehow sorted in an order that makes sense. And I wanted to put in a really easy example to show you that that is not true. Google is not a fact checker, and so the results are not going to be sorted by reliability. Often they're going to be sorted by who paid to be listed first. So here's an example. If you type in best running shoes, the first result you're going to get from Google is from Nike, and the second is from Allbirds. And if you look closely, you can see that both of these results are ads, meaning Nike and Allbirds paid to be listed first. And you have to scroll down to find the information you might really be looking at, which is some kind of evaluation of what the best running shoes are. So while it's a good technique to use Google to research websites, you also have to be aware that if you're looking at Google, the results themselves require you to sort through and try to get the best information. So let's say, having just heard all of this, that you're thinking to yourself, I don't want to be a professional fact checker. I don't have time to do all that kind of stuff. I don't even have time to look for running shoes, so I certainly don't have time to look at every website and see what other sources are saying about it. There are some shortcuts. This issue, because it's become such a problem, has led to a lot of really good responses, and there are some fact-checking sites that are quite reliable that are already researching these rumors and these stories as quickly as they come out. Obviously, no one can keep up with the infodemic that we're in, but there are sites that you can rely on and go to the sites and check out rumors you may hear, stories from your crazy uncle, stories you may see in your Facebook feed. You can go to these fact-checking sites and look them up. And here's an example. So if you want to find out whether the Pope in fact endorsed Donald Trump, and you go to a site called, oh, sorry, I forgot I added this slide too. In case you were wondering just how crazy that story was, the Pope apparently endorsed Hillary Clinton in the same election, which is a neat trick and would be your first clue that there's something wrong with the story. But if you wanted to find out the truth of these stories, you can go to one of these fact-checking sites. I've given CITA a list, as I said, and you'll be getting that. A good one is factcheck.org. And you can find the answer. Here's just the shorthand version. Did Pope Francis endorse Donald Trump? No, the Pope has not endorsed him. If you were to read the whole page, there'd be more detail on how they did the fact check. And there are quite a few of these that are trying to stay current with some of the more publicized rumors out there. It's just a shorthand way to fact check without going through the multiple steps that you may need to do if you can't find the information on a fact-checking site. And by the same token, you can go to a fact-checking site and get a rating of the story about whether the Pope endorsed Hillary Clinton. There are also fact-checking sites that address, including the ones I've just showed you, but that address some of these fake health stories. So you remember I showed you the Facebook story suggesting that if you breathed in steam from water boiled with orange peels, you could reduce your exposure to COVID-19. Another well-respected fact-checking institute site called PolitiFact has fact-checked that site, and it will give you the short version. Clearing out your sinuses will definitely not make you less likely to catch COVID-19. And then again, you can click and read more about it. In addition to these fact-checking sites, another method, I guess, of fighting the kinds of disinformation we're seeing out there now is just to go directly to a trusted source. So when you're talking about COVID-19, for example, the World Health Organization has started a page called Mythbusters. And this is an example of another story that circulated quite widely in the first month or two of the pandemic. Up here on the right, the news was that if you could hold your breath for 10 seconds or more without coughing, then you would be free from COVID-19. And this story was attributed to Stanford Medicine. It got such a wide circulation that Stanford Medicine had to issue a retraction saying, we never did a study like that, and we certainly never reached a conclusion like that. And now this rumor, the story, is one of the many, many myths that the World Health Organization has on its Mythbusters site. So if you're just getting bad information or information you don't know what to do with about COVID-19, this is World Health Organization site is a really good place to go. It's interesting, I was just updating these slides the other day, and I decided I'd look at the one of the more recent rumors that antibiotics cure COVID. And again, if you just Google it, as you see from this screenshot, I was pleased to see that the first result I got here was a COVID-19 alert and the Mythbusters site from the World Health Organization. So just going to trusted sites, and again, some of these will be on the resources that you're going to get, is another way that you can do a quick check on something that you might have heard from the crazy uncle or the crazy niece, and try to get an answer so that you can evaluate information. Okay, I'm going to turn this back to Ryan, who will talk a little more about some tips that you can use to figure out what's true.
Yeah, so we've been talking about political fake news and health-related fake news, but there's also a lot of other bad false content online that doesn't relate to those topics. It might relate to celebrities, or in this case, here's an example. Did Norway legalize marriage between humans and animals? So that was a claim that was circulated online. And this is another fact-checking website, Snopes, which if you use, you can find a fact check for this particular story. And the good thing about Snopes is, I use this site all the time, is that it has for each fact check, it has a lot of information which describes how they came up with the rating that they assigned a claim, whether it's false or true or mixed true, or what have you. And you can read all about that information, but they also just have like a too long, didn't read sort of section where they tell you exactly what's true and false about the claim. The other point I want to make with this particular story is if you read the byline, it says a 2-year-old Cameroonian blog post found itself going viral in August 2019, especially among American readers with one eye on the end of days. This brings up another point when talking about, what to look for when you look at information online, which is the date of the information. Sometimes photos or stories that are from years past will emerge on social media, or they'll start going viral and they'll get reported on as if they're from today. And one really obvious example that I see is like photos of social gatherings. Right now, there'll be photos of social gatherings and people are like, oh my goodness, but the gathering is actually from years prior. So I think keeping an eye on the date of information is another important tip. Another resource that is kind of new and I think is really cool is called metafact.io. That's the name of the website. The idea here is that you can ask experts questions directly that you're unsure about, and they'll respond, laying out the cases, whether it's true, false, and giving you a bunch of details. If you go on the website now, there's tons of great questions about COVID that experts have weighed in on. And I think it's a really awesome model that I hope sticks around for a long time. Finally, as you can see, someone asked the question, is gluten unhealthy? 94% of the experts rated the claim as negative, and then they all type, most of them often type lots of information supporting their stance, which is great. Additionally, you can always use Wikipedia. I know when I was growing up in school, I'm not very old, teachers would talk about, is Wikipedia a trusted source? Don't use Wikipedia. I think, and I think lots of people think, that Wikipedia can be a good source for information, especially if you're just trying to learn about something you're not familiar with, an event, a person, etc. Wikipedia is an online encyclopedia, which I'm sure many know can be edited by anybody, which means a lot of people can put their input into information. But it's important to note that Wikipedia is pretty diligent about, when people make edits, they have to provide ample sourcing. Wikipedia will give you warnings on pages for which the sources don't seem quite enough, or there's some kind of dispute. And Wikipedia often has really long reference lists that you can use to read more. So I think Wikipedia is an awesome source to keep in mind as well. And finally, I want to talk about something I mentioned in my prior slides, that education about fact checking and digital literacy. This is an organization that my research lab at Stanford works with, called MediaWise, that tries to create educational content that anybody can access on how to fact check, how to sort fact from fiction online, and just generally how to learn about the online news environment. So these links will be in the handout that Sita sends out. But if you go to the first link, MediaWise is a program run by the Poynter Institute, which is a nonprofit journalism firm. They have tons of courses that you can look at and enroll in. And specifically, just to plug myself, MediaWise is currently, in the lead up to the 2020 election, running a MediaWise for Seniors course. Seniors in this case means 50 and up. They've never done this before, and I'm working with them to study the effects of the course on the people who take it. So if you want to enroll, the course is open now. It's got great content from Joan London and Sanjay Gupta and many others, and there will be a link that you'll get. So there's resources all over the place online to learn about and to fight against this type of content.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to give you one more tip, and then talk a little more about common sense, and then we'll be taking your questions. So again, if you have questions, type them into the Q&A. Another shortcut that is gaining a lot of traction out there is a nutrition label that you can add to your browser. And I guess what we're doing with each of these different methods is trying to give you an idea that works for you. We all have different ways we like to do research, and we all have more and less time. So one other shortcut is an extension to your browser created by a group of journalists under the rubric of NewsGuard. And NewsGuard has rated nearly 6,000 sites, and they deliver 95% of the online news content that people engage with. NewsGuard will tell you, if you have this extension installed and you go to one of these sites that they've rated, they'll give you, in language we all understand from other kinds of ratings, a green, a red, or other warning or statement about the site that just gives you an immediate way to figure out whether this site is generally reliable or generally failing to meet basic standards of credibility and transparency. So that's just one more option. This, for example, is what NewsGuard says about something called the healthimpactnews.com site. Proceed with caution. This website violates basic standards. So with all of that, I also want to just step back for a minute and give you some common sense tips and just remind everybody of how these platforms are built and how they make their money. One of the ways that platforms will try that are built to keep you online is to engage you so that you can see, they can keep you online longer and show you more advertisements. And that has resulted in a phenomenon that I'm sure most of you have heard of called clickbait. And clickbait just means that you'll see a headline, and the only way to find out more about that headline, they'll give you a sort of teaser, and the only way to find out more about it is to click again. So man tries to hug a wild lion. You won't believe what happens next. The only way to find out what happens next is to click. And the reason the algorithm is set up to deliver this kind of material to you is so that you will click and therefore be online 5 minutes longer than you might otherwise have been, and keep going perhaps down a rabbit hole and engage with sites that you really are not that interested in and probably don't need to know about, and largely so see a large number of advertisements. So when you see something like this, you don't need to be studying fake news and its history to figure out that, you know, this is just aimed at trying to get me to stay online longer. It's just a common sense technique. It doesn't work with a lot of what we've been talking about, like manipulated images, but just be aware that clickbait is still a problem and still something you'll see online. And just, if you're aware of it, you know that you don't have to get sucked in on something like this. I love puzzles. This is the kind of thing that if I had nothing else to do, I'd probably want to click on it, but I know that a pop-up test is just a way to keep me online longer. And I also know that I really don't need to be doing that. Celebrity gossip is another way that people will be lured in by what they see online. And again, you know, maybe you want to read about this stuff, but most likely you don't want to be shown a bunch of ads and whatever else comes with that. So try to just keep in mind that you don't have to click on everything that looks like it might be interesting. It's just a rabbit hole. So I guess I just wanted to sum up with this 3-step list from the Stanford History Education Group. If you want to just think about this, step back and think about how do I evaluate what I see? Well, first you think, who's behind the information? We talked about ways you can discover that. You can do your own research, as I showed you with the Employment Policies Institute. You can do a fact check to see who's behind it. You can go to a trusted source, but some way or another, you need to find a way you're comfortable with that lets you figure out who's behind it so that you can evaluate whether this is something you want to read, let alone send on to other people. You also want to look at what the evidence is. You remember the Teen Vogue cover I showed you. Well, the only evidence of those young women ripping up the Constitution is that image. You won't find a story about that. You won't find any proof of that happening. The only evidence is the wrong information itself. And you can bet, for example, that when you get to stories like that, or the third bullet here, what other sources say, you can bet that if the Pope had endorsed either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, you would have been reading about that everywhere, right? You wouldn't just be seeing that in your Facebook feed or in something that someone sent you. You would see it everywhere. So if other sources are not talking about this big news item, that's a good clue that what you're looking at or hearing about may not be accurate. And just to drive this home a little bit and remind you of fact-checking sites, this quote is attributed to Mark Twain. That's what I put up at the beginning, but nobody's ever found any proof that he actually said it. So Snopes has found this to be an unproven claim, and it's just a reminder that you know, we got to do a little work if we're going to understand what we're looking at. Here's a list of the studies that Ryan referred to and some of the other information that we've used in this presentation. And it's been great talking with you all, and I really want to hear what you have to say. So we're both going to hang around for a little while and take questions and share ideas.
Before we do that, we'd like to actually do a poll. So let me start that. This is one on fake news spotting. Something's going wrong with it. Let me try this again. You should be seeing a poll on fake news spotting.
Yeah, it's showing up.
I'm not seeing any votes. Oh, here come one. Remember to hit the submit button at the bottom. This is also a good time if you have other questions for the presenters to put them in the Q&A session, and we'll be going through some of those. I still have people submitting, so I'm going to hold off on this poll a little bit longer. Okay, I'll give you another 5 seconds. Okay, very good. I'm going to end polling now. Thank you very much. I'll share those results for people. So we can see that people have been fooled. One person said too many times. Other 17 people said every so often. And a good number of you actually question everything. That's interesting. In terms of where do you get your news from? Majority of you get it from traditional media, but also from online versions of traditional media. 25% from social media. And I look at the name of the publisher and see if it's a reputable source. Seems to be the #1 answer on that. So very good. Thank you very much. Sita, would you like to now do the questions?
Oh, okay. So there are quite a few questions. I shall go from the top. There is one, somebody's asking, hasn't propaganda been known well before printing? Why not use that word? Because when we were struggling to use the fake news.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea. Propaganda is, I think it's a little more generic. It doesn't quite get us to the phenomena that is happening now, in part because it has been around for a long time. But yes, there's been propaganda since medieval times, when during the English Civil War, there was pamphleteering going on and people were sending out propaganda on what the other side was doing. I think that word is probably as good as any. I think it has a little more of an advertising connotation these days, but no, I wouldn't quibble with you on that at all.
I think the next one is, I don't know if it's a question or an opinion. It says, how do you say that small people are a small fraction, or the question is not that very clear. It says, read fake news while CNN, ABC, MSNBC are watched daily by most of the populations. Sounds more like an opinion.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's a good question. You know, 2 answers. One is that CNN, ABC, MSNBC, reputable news organizations such as those aren't disseminating fake news. Like the vast majority of the time, journalists, despite what you might hear from some political elites, have a great deal of integrity in the content that they produce and the work that they do. And they have very high standards for fact-checking information. But maybe what the question is getting at is just like, a lot of people consume news. Why do so few people consume fake news? It tends to be the case that fake news, as I mentioned, is heavily targeted towards certain individuals. So not everybody who sees news may also see fake news, particularly online. It's a certain type of person with certain past behaviors and maybe certain demographic characteristics who is targeted by purveyors of fake news and is likely to encounter it as they go through the rest of their content. And once you encounter some of it, you're likely to encounter more of it. So that's potentially a reason why, even though a lot of people, as our polls indicate, engage with news, maybe only a small number of those people end up seeing a lot of the fake news.
Ryan, I have a question about that response. You mentioned several things about, you and Susan both mentioned about how the web services actually mine you for information. So is it possible that once you start to follow a line of fake news, you're actually fed more fake news along the same line?
Exactly. Scammers use similar techniques. If somebody falls for it once, they're going to keep hitting it with them more and more. The same logic is, at least based on research, can be used to think about fake news. You're exactly right, Henry.
One of the questions I see in the Q&A had to do with whether there's a better search engine than Google, and some of what you see online, it's not necessarily going to be fake news, but it will be ads, and it may be other information that you'll just see popping up depending on what site you visit. A search engine that does not track you as you move around online is something called DuckDuckGo. So that's something you can take a look at. It's not as robust as Google, but they do not track your personal information. So you can avoid some of the pop-ups and things you'll see on Google.
Okay, here's another question. How do we best determine who is behind some of the pro and con mailers for propositions and candidates when there isn't much daylight about who a particular group may actually be?
Yeah, we could do several hours on California propositions. I'm a native. I've been voting in this state for a long time, and yeah. My current favorite is, I think I may start a proposition to end all propositions, but just that there be no propositions. But putting that aside, it's a little bit of a different question, but one thing you could do that we talked about today would be to take the name of that group, put it in quotes, Google it, and see what you can find out about it online. You can also look at the people who are supporting it and the groups they're affiliated with. I mean, you kind of have to do your own online research about both the supporters, who they are, whether you think your politics align with them or not, and the groups they represent, when they were formed, and what they're standing for. The other thing you can do, again, this is not really the area of the talk, but I think I think you really do get a lot of information if you just look at who is supporting it and whether that representative, for example, is somebody who you would vote for or not. But it's very tricky with propositions, and they all end up in court anyway. So you probably don't want to start me on that path.
What about this one? How do you reliably fact check a website? Isn't there, wouldn't one of the best propaganda technique be to set up a biased fact check website?
Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
certainly that would be, somebody in the audience has a mind for this kind of thing. That certainly could be a strategy. I'm not personally familiar with prominent examples of that happening. Susan, I'm not sure if you are.
No, there's a lot of questions about this I see in the chat. I mean, the fact-checking sites are free to the user. They're supported by donations. Part of it is just that there has been so much news about fake news that these sites have sprung up. And if you read, I assembled my list of what good fact-checking sites are by reading about what good fact-checking sites are and reading more than one source. You need to read a lot, and then you need to look at it yourself and see if you think it's reliable. I'm not aware of a successful fact-checking site, passing itself off as reliable and then later being found to not be. I haven't come across that, but it's certainly within the realm, the range of possibility.
Stuart also asked a really good question on this topic: how to reply to friends who don't believe Snopes, PolitiFact, etc. are real and trustworthy. As I mentioned, these sites don't just give you true, false, and just leave it at that. They typically have a ton of information that you can go read and understand about why they came up with that particular rating. So It's not to say that these sites aren't doing their research. I would say that a useful strategy for maybe persuading somebody who thinks they're bogus is to walk them through an example. I mean, there's lots of stuff that goes into these ratings, and I think they're well done.
So along that line, is it one, what I'm hearing is that the news consumers, we as news consumers, we have to be more savvy. We have to be very, think critically and reflective thinking and all that. Isn't there, is the government also trying to do some regulation on how these social media and other websites are supposed to tag if it detects that things are false? Should there be more such regulations?
So I'm gonna answer that question, but in a slightly roundabout way. The platforms themselves are doing something. I'm not going to get into whether it's enough or not, but for example, Facebook is taking down certain kinds of speech now and certain kinds of political ads. Facebook also has a method where you, if you think a story is false, you can report it. I had a slide for that, but I don't think I need to show you. You can use their help bar, and there's a method for you to help flag information you think may be false or questionable. The issue with regulation, again, is there are entire days of seminars devoted to this. One of the main reasons that we are in the situation we're in my opinion, is that the platforms have developed with the protection of something called the Communications Decency Act, which essentially makes the platforms themselves not responsible for the content that people post on it. And there were a lot of reasons back in the 90s, maybe, to pass this law to help this new technology develop without the threat of lawsuits, and to allow the platforms, in fact, to take down information or content without being liable in that direction, and also to leave up content without having to check everything. Nobody had any idea back in 1996 when that law passed that we would end up in a place we are now with the kind of usage and worldwide reach and just news crush that has resulted. So there is an ongoing discussion in Congress and including coming out of the administration about whether to repeal or otherwise modify this Communications Decency Act that is essentially, as I said, just lets the platforms take a hands-off approach and say, we're not responsible for what's up there. There have been some inroads made into that law. For example, with respect to child sex trafficking, that kind of content is not protected by the Communications Decency Act. The platforms do have an obligation to take it down, and there are other movements to chip away at this blanket immunity. It's the kind of thing that I think all I have to say to this group is, well, Congress is going to have to agree on what the solution is. So it's not imminent, but those are the kinds of solutions that are being discussed, which would begin with either doing away with or limiting the platform's immunity, so that they have to develop, through artificial intelligence and other means, they have to develop ways of helping people understand the veracity of what they see online.
Talking of artificial intelligence, here's another question that says, can you address substituting voice images? I heard people claim Trump's voice was dubbed when he spoke on the bus before the 2016 election. So I also seen along the same line, these days there are very believable videos, like, the famous Obama speaking thing that he never spoke. How do we address those kind of fake items?
Well, it's not unlike any of the other kinds of fake news that we're talking about, right? I mean, if you see something and you don't know whether it's been said by Trump or Obama or whoever it is, you can look for other reports of that. If you are only seeing a video that appears to be Obama saying something that you think he might not ever say, you should be seeing a headline from the New York Times or the Mercury News or the Sacramento Bee, the Miami Herald. You should be seeing that news all over the place. If some kind of shocking statement has been made by a well-known politician or celebrity, you shouldn't, the only evidence should not be the dubbing itself.
Do you know how we can find out these fact-checking websites, how they are funded?
I mean, most of them, I think, will talk about the ways in which they're funded and they're about information. For example, PolitiFact, which is a common one, is funded by the Poynter Institute, who I mentioned before, who are funded from a variety of organizations and donations. Many of them are sustained on donations, I believe. But in the spirit of providing holistic information, most of them, at least when I've looked, have pretty thorough reporting of, like, you know, where they come from, who runs them, and where their money comes from.
One of the questions I see, and I'm almost like to throw this open to the audience, is, you know, why do people do this? Why are people putting out questions? I think one of the questions, putting out news about Bigfoot, or more broadly, why are they putting out fake information about COVID? Why are they putting out fake political news? And I'm sure we could all opine on that. When I started thinking about the health stuff, I thought, I had that same reaction of why are people doing this? And one very small part of it is snake oil salesmen, right? There are people who want to sell you something, often vitamins, for example. So you might put up something about how if you take a certain kind of vitamin, you're not going to get COVID, and that could have a direct impact on your sales. But I don't think that that is the real motivator for much of this stuff. You could also make the obvious argument that some people are doing these kinds of things in order to manipulate election results and otherwise disrupt U.S. institutions. We're all familiar with all that stuff that's going on. But I think, and I'll be curious if Ryan and the people he works with at Stanford are looking at this. There's a big black hole for me when I think about this in terms of the psychology of people who are just putting junk out there. If it's not financial and it's not some sort of political statement or effort to manipulate a result, why do it? And you know, I do think that's a question for the psychologists. I don't have the answer to that black hole question, but I think eventually we're going to need to understand more about that as we try to combat this phenomenon.
And just to add on to what Susan said, I'm interested in understanding the psychological profile of people who share this information for the reasons that's not, you know, that Susan mentioned. I'm not familiar with work to that end. What I can tell you from the research world is that I haven't really seen studies that have been able to credibly link fake news or particular instances of disinformation to swaying election results. One, you know, reason for that is it's hard to make such a claim, right? There's so much information out there. How do we know that this singular piece of information you saw that turned out to be false, you know, changed your mind about a voting decision? People are trying to find that link. And I will say just generally that maybe one reason to not be as, you know, existentially worried about this problem is that researchers have had a hard time linking fake news exposure. We know who's exposed and we think we may know why, but hard time linking that to real world outcomes and real world behaviors. Not to say there aren't anecdotal examples, but hard to find at scale, and people are trying because that would get published in an excellent journal. So maybe one reason to be optimistic.
There's another couple of questions on the fact check websites. Are they generally free or paid? There's this what was the News Guard. They have a free version and a paid version. How do we choose that? And then how do we get update on new fact-checking websites that are coming up?
Yeah, NewsGuard I know comes free with the Microsoft Edge browser. I'd have to actually go back and look at the site again. I know they were offering a free version through July, and then I think they extended it. So you can just go to the NewsGuard site and look for that. It's newsguardtech.com. I think I can put that in the I'll put that in the chat. I don't think that's on our resource list. So you can just look at the options on the site. Sorry, was there another part of that question?
You know, there are additional fact check websites are coming. How do you find out about those?
The newest one I know about is the MetaFact one that Ryan talked about. I think the fact-checking sites are getting overwhelmed. I know that Snopes was pulling back a little bit from trying to cover everything. I think we've given you the ones at least that we know the most about. And the other way I would do this, as I said, would be to go to a trusted source. There's another one that I didn't mention in the talk, but it's an international the AFP site. I'm forgetting what the initials stand for.
Oh, the French Association of French.
Yeah, that has a lot of good information about rumors that are out there about COVID. I will tell you that I used to have the CDC on my fact-checking site, and I'm not as comfortable putting that on there right now. So it's part of it is just keeping up with where the news issue is, and then figuring out what organization or what journalistic publication you trust to give you the straight scoop. It's not just fact checking; it can be looking at trusted sources.
Here's another question that says, "What's the best way to counterattack someone's fake news?"
I'm sorry, I just didn't hear it. Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, it says, what's the best way to counterattack someone's fake news?
I think we might be running up on time, so maybe this will be our last question. So one thing you can do, and maybe, you know, if you hear this from them and talking to them face to face, or maybe not so much these days, or you see it on their social media, you could find and share a fact check site that we talked about. Now, you know, understandably, it can be kind of intimidating to see somebody sharing fake news and say, you know, you don't want to get into an argument with them maybe because they're your friend, or you want to maintain the quality of your relationship with them and don't want to seem hostile. So I think, you know, there's simple ways you could maybe word it like, hey, you know, it looks like it might be more complicated than that, and then maybe share a fact checking site or share some kind of source that disputes the claim that they've shared. Or, hey, have you seen this? Like, this is related. I think there are certain ways to construct the way that you approach people about sharing fake news that can, you know, make you seem more friendly rather than adversarial, because, you know, not many of us want to be adversarial politically on Facebook or other social media all the time, or face to face. But yeah, it can be difficult to talk to people about this problem if you see them doing it. And people are currently doing research actually on the best ways to talk about particularly older people about instances in which they see them engaging in this behavior. What's the best way to approach that conversation? It's difficult.
Yeah, and I'll just add in. I do think, I know you guys have two more polls you want to do, so I agree that we should wrap this up. But I just from the having been on the planet for a while, I think one of the ways to talk about this kind of stuff with people is to take something you see online that is certifiably ridiculous, right? Like Norway legalizing marriage between humans and animals that you can both agree on, right? And you can use that as an example of the kinds of things that might be online as a launching point. You know, find a place where you can both agree that you're seeing something ridiculous, show how the fact check works, and maybe try to get at it that way rather than diving right into the political debate or whatever the substantive problem is.
Okay, as you guys are observing, it's getting late and people are starting to leave. We have two polls, a very short poll, one on about this program today, and then one on future topics. But thank you, Susan and Ryan. It was very enlightening. And then thank you, all the audience. There's been very interesting questions that people want to share and get tips on. And I'm sure we are walking away with the message that we all have to be careful how we consume and how we contribute to fake news. Thank you again.
Yeah, and I've got the poll open for today's event, and shortly after this, we're going to open up the one for our future events. So let me
Can you share the future event?
remember to hit submit. I'll give you another 5 seconds. Okay. Now on future events, do you want to say a word about
yes.
this?
I have a slide that I'm sharing. So our next event is scheduled for October 25th at 2 p.m. It's again on a cybersecurity topic about scam artists and how to recognize them before they get you. It's by a cybersecurity consultant, and please register to join the event. And
by the way, one of our audience today actually was asking about something that's relevant to that, which appears to be a scam that was sent to them as a way to actually steal their money. So I'm going to now launch the next poll, which is on our future topics, because we're interested in hearing what our audience would like to see. Oops, it stopped. Seems like when I move my mouse, it stops the poll, so I have to be careful.
it's still not, I don't see anybody responding still.
I've got one.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a longer question.
Yes, we do. We are planning quite a few topics, and you responding to these will help us prioritize the topics. And also, you know, if there are speakers and panelists that you would like to suggest, we'll reach out to you if you respond to these polls.
By the way, on that last question about how to respond to people, I have a set of friends and relatives who routinely send me fake news. And it's always a very delicate process for dealing with them. One of the things I usually do is take the time, do the research, find 2 or 3 or 4 references that you can give them, send it back to them, and remind them that you're being hard on the problem, not on them. It doesn't mean they're a bad person, but that you need to look at these things because basically someone is playing them. Okay, I'm going to close up this poll in 5 seconds. Thank you.
So the registration for the next event, did you finish the poll, Henry?
I did, but it said there's a polling error.
Yikes.
I can still see the results though. So shall we go ahead and wrap up, Sita?
Yeah, so do you want to show, you can't show the result? You can't share the result? Okay, we'll take care of it. So yes, I want to say that for the next event, you can register. I haven't put the link here. The link, I'll email the link to all the registrants here, and you can also go to tinyurl. Yeah, actually, I'll send the link to the registrants by email.
And will you also be sending on the handout that was prepared by our speakers?
Yes, as I put in the chat window that a link for the handout is in the chat window, as well as it'll be emailed to all the registered attendees tomorrow or so. And then the recording will also be available, and we'll send the link to the recording and the link to the resource list to the registered attendees.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you for supporting the Cupertino Library and the Cupertino Library Foundation. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Everybody.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Ryan.